Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Michelle McMurray-Heath, and I'm so honored to be able to moderate today's panel of distinguished leaders from across the scientific ecosystem. The topic of our panel is coronavirus, the performance of our health innovation ecosystem, and it's a big topic. And AAAS could not have assembled a better group of panelists to help us really tackle the issue. So I truly believe that while we're living through one of the most challenging times in our nation's history, they've also been clarifying times. Clarifying in the sense that we are seeing the best of the scientific community. We're seeing unprecedented collaboration and cooperation. We're seeing our community working around the clock to address the pandemic. We're also seeing why each of us became passionate about science in the first place and why it's become our mission and our calling. Perhaps at no other time in human history has scientific discovery moved at such a rapid pace. We're engaged in an unprecedented response to the pandemic, one that's really galvanized intellectual capacity, mobilized the passion and purpose of our community, and allowed us to organize around the most important scientific challenges of our lifetime. The result and the pace of innovation has been breathtaking, and it will transform the application of science and our ability to be at the forefront of addressing the needs of human health, humanity, and humankind. But the key will be making sure that these scientific advances are reaching more people in more communities and in a way that is most just and equitable. Because one thing the pandemic has exposed is how much harder underserved populations have been hit during the past few months, and how much more education and work we will need to do to build real trust and confidence in these communities. And that means pushing back on misinformation and protecting science from politicization. That comes from both the left and the right. It means working closely with community leaders and those across the medical community to better educate and inform hard-hit communities about the work we are doing. And it means doing the hard work. Really, it's necessary to build trust and confidence. So I'm hoping today's conversation can help us address these issues and provide some concrete takeaways that we can utilize in our own work. So let me introduce our panelists. You've got a glimpse of Phyllis Arthur, Vice President of Infectious Disease and Diagnostic Policy at BIO, the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. Hamilton Bennett, Director of Vaccine Access and Partnerships at Moderna. Dr. Robert Gabay, Chief Science and Medical Officer at the American Diabetes Association. Reed Tuckson, Managing Director of Tuckson Health Connections. And Holden Thorpe, Editor-in-Chief of the Science Family of Journals. I thought I would start with two polling questions for our audience. And so we'll hopefully be able to see the fascinating results coming from these later on. So would you participate in a COVID vaccine clinical trial? And if a vaccine were available today, would you and your family take it? So while we're getting started, getting those questions answered, we'll kick off our conversation. Let me start with Phyllis. So we're starting to see the results come in. We can see our highly educated and mobilized science policy audience is torn. So with that, we'll start our discussions. And Phyllis, can you give us an overview of the COVID-19 pipeline?
Absolutely. Thanks, Michelle, and thanks for the opening, and thanks to the AAAS team for including me in this panel. Can I have the first slide? I just have two quick slides, really to lay out what's happening with regard to the development of vaccines against COVID-19. So at BIO, through our tracker, we have been looking at about 190 vaccines worldwide being developed. And what we're seeing, certainly that's most exciting, is a number of those vaccines are entering that final, very important phase of development. So we are seeing some products outside of the US, particularly the Chinese and the Russians, have vaccines in late phase 3 and are starting to deploy those in certain populations. And then we're also seeing some major products that are coming from the fantastic partnership between small and large companies to make vaccines across a host of different vaccine platforms that are entering into that late phase 3 as well. So we're very excited to see how these products are moving, actually at an unprecedented pace. But I think one of the things that is so important for the science is really a lot of that unprecedented pace is because of the use of novel technologies that really speed the development, in particular, the early stage development that allows you to get to a vaccine candidate so much quicker. And I'm sure Hamilton will talk about this when she speaks next. So a lot of this work that we're seeing in vaccines, besides the work to stack the clinical trials and do manufacturing at risk, is really about the great developments that have been made in vaccine development technology and platforms that are allowing companies to get to from idea to actually vaccine candidates that can be tried in humans more quickly. So I want to go to the next slide, please. I think I also wanted to share this because it relates to our discussion about equity. One of the most important steps that will have to happen after the vaccines are authorized by the FDA is that there will be this application of a prioritization framework that's under review and development by the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices within the CDC. This group, along with taking into consideration other frameworks that have been thought through by Johns Hopkins and certainly by the national academies, which Dr. Tuxen will talk about later, are looking at how to make sure we prioritize the early stage vaccines to those who are the most at risk. And what they've done in their approach, I think, is very important. They've looked at not just occupational risk and not just communities of color more impacted, but the intersection of these varying issues, such that you're seeing the groups that are most at risk for a host of different reasons that could be occupational, sociocultural, or underlying disease. And that allows for an interesting opportunity to discuss how these various issues intersect with each other and drives the prioritization that hopefully drives equity as we have the vaccines available. So that's my last slide. I'll turn it back to you, Michelle.
Wonderful. Now Hamilton is going to join us and give us a little bit of insights from her vantage point at Moderna about what we can expect from novel therapeutic approaches and vaccines.
Thank you.
There you
and I
go.
just have a few slides as well. So as Phyllis mentioned, there are a number of reasons that digital technologies and these novel technologies like mRNA come to mind when people are talking about revolutionizing vaccine development, and certainly in the pandemic space. So first, these digital technologies like nucleic acids technologies or vectored vaccines allow you to create complex immunogenic antigens like a CMV pentamer or a Zika VLP that present as they would following natural infection, mimicking our body's natural response, unbiased to the needs of the manufacturing process that made them. The manufacturing process for these novel technologies are also warm-based. They're well characterized, readily scalable. So the same process and facility used across Moderna's prophylactic vaccine portfolio is scaled and redirected to make hundreds of millions to billions of doses a year. And the same is true for the vectored vaccines as well. And this is unlike the inactivated or attenuated technologies of old that are sometimes referred to as being more art than engineering. So when there are these emerging infectious diseases that quickly enter our awareness as significant public health threats, pandemic flu, Zika, SARS-CoV-2, it's logical that these digital technologies are going to be among the first vaccines to respond to interrupt the course of the outbreak. So on this slide, I'm showing Moderna's development pipeline, which spans 6 modalities. And I won't spend too much time here, but what's important to understand is that Moderna has spent a decade improving our prophylactic vaccine platform, understanding how best to manufacture and deliver mRNA. It's one of our core modalities, and when SARS-CoV-2 came to our awareness in early January, it's based on this platform that we felt obligated to respond. So if we go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So here I'm just showing a high-level timeline of the program, just kind of indicative, I think, of many of us that are in this novel space and the speed at which we were able to respond. The sequence of the novel coronavirus became available the weekend of January 10th. 3 days later, we had finalized our vaccine sequence. By the end of the month, with our collaborators at NIAID and CEPI, we had developed a plan to bring mRNA 1273 to phase 1. When we began dosing in mid-March, just over 2 months after release of the product and the sequence, I think Dr. Fauci said we set a world indoor record. But I think those of us that are closer to the program look at the timelines and see a little bit of room for improvement. As spring came, the virus continued to circulate. It became clear that this was not a seasonal threat. In April, Moderna expanded the collaboration with the US government to continue clinical development. By May, we had expanded our manufacturing capacity, and our goal was always to get a product to the public as fast as safely possible. Along the way, we were releasing data and information to the public as we were able. We initiated our phase 3 study in late July, and we remain on track to have efficacy data by the end of the year. Similar timelines have been demonstrated by Pfizer and Janssen, others that are currently in phase 3. And if all goes well, collectively, we'll have hundreds of millions of doses available to Americans in early 2021. And we can start talking now about how do we deploy those vaccines, as Phyllis alluded to previously. In order to do that, we collectively need to ensure that the public has confidence in our process. And there's enough confidence that they will receive that vaccine once available. As we asked in the polling question at the top, if there were a vaccine available today, would you take it? And I think we need to get the American public to an answer of yes, if we want to have any chance of stopping this pandemic. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Hamilton. Okay, so with that, we'll kick off the conversations. So I'll start by saying that the poll results were very interesting because about 60% of our audience said that they would be willing to take a vaccine. About 50% said they'd be willing to participate in a clinical trial. But it was interesting, and some of the comments in the chat was very clear that it depends on how much confidence they have in whether FDA and regulators are allowed to do their job. So that's part of, I think, the banner that Phyllis and Hamilton have been carrying through the summer is we have to make sure that the science is allowed to speak for itself. So thank you both for your presentations. And we have to ask, how do we ensure that there's going to be equitable access to the breakthroughs? And I'm sure that many of you have seen the New York Times story last week about the challenges and misinformation that Father Paul Abernathy and his teams in Pittsburgh face when trying to get Black communities to volunteer for COVID trials. I think the title of the article is, "I Don't Want to Be a Guinea Pig." On the other side of this, we've also heard stories of religious leaders in other communities questioning why historically Black colleges and their associated medical schools are recruiting for COVID trials and why Ivy League schools are not. And we've seen politicians on both sides of the aisle politicizing this issue and injecting it with misinformation and in some cases deception. So I'd like to start with Robert, Reed, and Holden. How should we be thinking about undoing the misinformation around the science of this disease, of the importance of clinical trial recruitment in communities of color and of building vaccine confidence in general? And how do we really galvanize and organize the scientific community around this goal? Anyone want to jump in?
Oh, look, go ahead and start. And just thanks for the opportunity to participate in what is clearly an important meeting. First, I think we need to realize that this is not an easy task. We are battling really literally decades of challenges. The Black community is very, very well and still very attuned to the challenges of the Tuskegee syphilis study. It exists still today as vibrantly as it did 15, 20 years ago when we tried to fight the HIV epidemic. The Henrietta Lacks experience lives very much going forward. The history of structural racism in American life is palpable. I think that it is also extraordinary that we still have the African American community needing to say out loud to every stakeholder community in this country that our lives matter. It is amazing that you still have to say that in a society that has the aspirations of a civilized democracy. So this is hard work. Trust once lost is difficult to regain. And so the first principle that I think we have to really underscore, everybody involved in this process from this moment on must make a declarative statement to themselves as an organization, as a business, or as an enterprise. Must say it to themselves as much as they say it to everyone, is that all lives matter equally. Black lives matter equally, and that the respect for the dignity of each human being is important. After you get to that, then we will have to do the slow hand-to-hand combat, community by community, in preparing the community-based organizations, the grassroots leadership to understand the facts. We have been doing that. I won't monopolize at this point in the conversation the work that we've been doing with all of the organized Black health leadership in this country. But I will say this as a set point. We've done our own survey, a very interesting survey, and it tells us that at least 60%, if not more, of the Black community would not take this vaccine today. And so this is a long haul, and I can come back to more details later.
Wonderful. Holden, do you want to jump in, from the vantage point of publications and journals?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for including me, and to Phyllis and Hamilton, thank you for everything you're doing to get us to the other side of this. You're the folks that are doing the real work. And Reed, I thank you for what you just said. I couldn't agree more. And I would just add that as far as equity in science is concerned, science needs to stop making excuses for why we've done such an abysmal job. There's always this litany of things that come up about why we haven't fixed these problems, and there's no excuse for having these problems. So I think we need to get people to accept that there aren't any legit excuses for these things. As far as COVID and misinformation is concerned, we've gotten thousands of COVID papers. We've published about 120, 110 of them. It's even harder to get a COVID paper into Science than a regular paper, and it's already pretty hard to get a paper into Science to begin with. They're wildly popular in terms of how much they get clicked on. It's very high stakes. Knock on wood, we haven't had a retraction yet. Some of our brothers and sisters have, and we don't gloat about that, because that could happen to anybody who gets a falsified data set. In news and insights, we have tried to bring as much clarity to this as we can, but it's an extraordinary uphill battle, because the President of the United States has only one goal, and that's to create as much confusion about this as he possibly can. And it's inescapable that depriving people of equity is part of why he's doing that, so that not everyone will benefit equally from medical science. And I think, what are we doing? We're speaking out as loudly as we can. Our peers are joining with us. I think we actually got somewhere on the vaccine protocol. I think we got to Han, and I'm proud to be part of the group that worked on that. And I think we've broken through a little bit of a barrier. For 75 years since Vannevar Bush, scientists have wanted to retreat into our labs and look at our spreadsheets and let other people stand up for other folks or for science. And I think, and I hope this will be irreversible. Now people know what it feels like to stand up for humanity and for science. And I'm hopeful we'll continue to do that long after this is over, with many, many other politicians on into the future.
Hold on, before we leave you, just want to follow up on that for 1 second. We're in this unprecedented time when 3 leading scientific journals have now come out with political viewpoints, all based upon COVID. New England Journal, The Lancet, Scientific American. I'm just curious how you have received this? I mean, it's unprecedented for science to be taking this type of point of view.
Yeah, the night before we sent the big one, first one I did in March, my editor and I were on the phone late at night saying, do you really think we should do this? And what put us over the edge is, you know, we knew that Don Kennedy was ill, and he's the most beloved science editor. And we both convinced ourselves that if Don Kennedy was the editor, he would have sent it in. So, you know, it was nice when some of the others came on board. And I think now, you know, it's pretty, if you have Science, Nature, New England Journal, Scientific American, Lancet, Medscape, you know, it's pretty unanimous that what has happened is unacceptable. When New England Journal posted their piece, I texted Eric Rubin and told him, thank you for your courage and welcome to Thunderdome.
Oh my goodness.
But we don't have any choice but to do this. This is a crisis, it's a catastrophe. And if we're not going to play every card we got right now, when are we going to do it?
Thank you. Thank you. You know, the stakes are also high for your community, Robert, you know, representing people with diabetes, and they're more likely to experience severe symptoms and complications from COVID. So how is the ADA approaching issues of acceptance of the vaccine, as well as the involvement of Americans with diabetes in the clinical trials?
Yeah, thank you for including me in the panel, and really enjoying the conversation. It is critically important, and to give you a sense of the stakes here, if you look at all the deaths from COVID in the US, 40% of them are in people with diabetes. We're literally living in a triple pandemic of rising rates of diabetes, obesity, and COVID all superimposed. And so that really explains this incredible death rate. You throw on top of that what we've been talking about, the health disparities that have really, COVID has brought out even, you know, things that we already knew, but even more staggering. You know, people of color are 6 times more likely to be hospitalized. So we have a lot of work to do. We have to build the trust for the treatments that are necessary. And I appreciate those comments about trust. And where do we find trust? I think we find trust in communities. And so working with community leaders, and the American Diabetes Association has been working hard in that realm for a long time. And I think for many people, their healthcare providers are a source of trust. And we have a long history of working with that group and the scientific community in our 80 years as an organization. So I think it's going to be this combination of efforts that are going to ensure that people living with diabetes are, along with other high-risk groups, really at the front of the line for inclusion in trials, and ultimately for the kinds of promising therapies and vaccines that we just heard about earlier.
I thought I was on mute when I said, wow, in response to your 40% of the deaths have been people with diabetes. So given that, has the ADA taken a position on whether or not diabetes should be an exclusion criteria for either COVID vaccine trials or therapeutic trials?
We strongly believe that people with diabetes should be included. I think we also strongly believe that people of color need to be included. Diabetes disproportionately affects people of color, and they need to be included in all of this work to develop the vaccine, and then once the vaccine is available in distribution. So absolutely, critically important.
Great, so I just want to return to Reed for a second. Reed, you served on a National Academies panel that developed a framework for the equitable allocation of an eventual vaccine. Can you talk to us a little bit about the framework and how it can help guide our thinking when it comes to reaching communities that are most vulnerable and susceptible, and where, frankly, you have the most work to do in building trust?
Yeah, I was very fortunate to be a part of the National Academy of Medicine's framework for the equitable allocation of COVID-19 vaccine report. It was very much grounded in the fundamental ethical principles that you would expect that would come out of a National Academy committee dealing with such an issue. And that is an unambiguous declaration of the importance of health equity in framing vaccine allocation decisions, a clear recognition that the extraordinary disproportionate impact of this virus on communities of color because of pervasive results of racism and structural inequity, and so much of to do with the kinds of jobs in which people of color are employed on the front lines, essential workers and so forth. Very clearly there, but also very clearly a report that highlighted also the importance of being very transparent in how decisions are being made, a focus on fairness and engagement with the public, a focus on transparency in terms of the obligation to communicate with the public openly, clearly, and accurately and straightforwardly as to why decisions are being made for the allocation decision. We had several phases. Phase one, which was focused on high-risk health workers for very obvious reasons, but phase 1B focused on people who are very vulnerable to mortality and morbidity because of their pre-existing comorbid conditions. And you know what those are, and particularly people with 2 or more were put in that priority category. In phase 2, we talked about those who are involved in our schools, our school workers, our school bus drivers, environmental services staff, as well as critical workers in other high-risk settings. And then we included in that people with 1 comorbid condition being important, as well as people living in homeless shelters and group homes. And then in phase 3, we talked about young adults, children, and workers in industries that are both important, but at moderately risk of exposure. And then finally, phase 4, which is everyone else. To complete my answer to your question, we made very clear recommendations about the importance of putting dollars and putting money at play to be able to work inside of communities and be able to engage them with clear communications. One of the things that we observed is that there are billions of dollars being spent by the federal government and the private sector. But at the end of the day, when you get down to getting the actual drug into the patient's arm, almost no dollars. And it is just a tragedy that we've got all this front end push, but at the critical moment to try to work with people to accept the vaccine, very little. So we called for very clear elements of intelligent, thoughtful, scientific, evidence-based engagement with communication strategies that also emphasize the Black health professionals, Black trusted leadership being engaged with their communities in an open dialogue. So putting all of that together, that was the essence of our report, a clear concern inside of that report for the ability to put resources to play to actually make a difference, as opposed to, oh, let's just turn this over and hope that community-based organizations will somehow manufacture, because of their mission, a response that will be commensurate to the level of challenge that they face. Now, this requires as much intelligence on the back end as the wonderful presentation from Hamilton on the front end. It's the same important emphasis. And if it isn't co-equal and balanced, poor Hamilton's work will go for naught.
And what's so important about what you said, Reed, is that it should be a science-based communication strategy. So those of us in the audience who do science policy as a living, you know, this is part of the spectrum of science policy that is so critical to get right here. So let's turn back to Hamilton for a minute. We know how important it is to design clinical trials that reflect the diverse patient populations that we aim to help. We've known that for a long time. And it's not just about ethnic or racial diversity, but also diversity of individuals with underlying health conditions that may place someone at a greater risk of suffering severe illness from COVID, such as those with diabetes. The American people need to see themselves in the data Hamilton, can you talk about Moderna, and I'm just going to editorialize here, Moderna's brave decision to change your recruitment strategies for your trial when you were not getting the diversity of participants that you were looking for?
Yeah, of course. So there are two ways that we influence the population in a clinical trial. The most direct way is to define the population in your protocol. What proportion should be elderly? What proportion should have underlying health conditions? We and many others have done this, and where possible across the vaccines that are currently in development, we've tried to strive for similar stratification and similar proportions. But then there's how you operationalize the study. And early on in the process of enrolling on our phase 3 COVE study, we saw that the population that was enrolling on our study was not representative of the community itself. Minority populations weren't participating, at least not at the rates that we had hoped to see them participate. And as we've been talking about, this is especially concerning when you acknowledge that the morbidity and mortality of COVID-19 is overwhelmingly borne by Black and Latinx communities. So it's really important that we enroll these populations most at risk in our studies. So Michelle, as you're saying, knowing that for public confidence, this vaccine study needed to be representative and also responsive, to the inequalities that we were seeing, we revised our recruitment strategy and felt that that was really the only logical answer. As soon as we started to see what was happening, we knew if we continued on our current pace that we would fail. And in a year where there is such politicization of science and everything that we're doing, we really felt that almost every decision that we make, whether it be on transparency of data or how we conduct our studies, every decision needed to be taken, as Reed said, with that end community in mind. We need to be doing all that we can now to build confidence so that when that vaccine is ready, people will trust in the data. So we immediately started working with our sites to increase engagement with minority communities. We extended the enrollment timeline to provide participants additional opportunity to enroll. To date, our study is still enrolling. We're just under 29,000 participants out of 30,000. Nearly 35% are from diverse communities, which is great to see. And certainly for groups that are historically underrepresented in clinical research. But many, as Robert mentioned, many of these communities also have underlying health conditions. So we've again revised our protocol to make sure that we revisit those proportions that we set out in the protocol to make sure that as we're increasing minorities, we're also making sure that they're eligible with the health conditions that they bring in to the study. It's really critical that, as you said, the people are able to see themselves in this study and they're able to trust the results of this study and that we can extrapolate those to the American public.
I think, Michelle, that's evident. I think what's interesting when we look back at this pandemic at some point when we're out of it, that we will look at what we've learned about how we construct our products particularly for a pandemic. I mean, I hope this ripples through everything that we make because it's pivotal for everything that the drug industry produces and all the research we do. But in a pandemic, it's particularly important because you're going to use these products across the general population. You're not going to test and screen, and you're not going to do all these other things. You really have to almost follow that intention to treat kind of idea of how we do clinical trials. And so this movement in enrollment criteria, this looking at this through that different lens, population lens, is I think extraordinarily important, and hopefully impacts vaccines going forward as we do more research, because it's one of the places where we've talked about it in my 20 some odd years in vaccines, but we've never overtly tried to really do it. And I think it's extremely important to carry this idea forward. I think the other thing that we've never seen before is you always get to the end of the trials, you go to your FDA and your ACIP meeting, and you put up the slide that shows the percent of populations, and then a whole bunch of people ask you a lot of questions about why the Black and Latin communities aren't at the right numbers, and it's too late. And so I think the other thing we're seeing here is this unprecedented transparency about the enrollment criteria and the enrollment levels. So all of the vaccine manufacturers show every single week on their website how they're doing, right? Every week, how am I doing at hitting the numbers? We've never really seen things like this before, and I think they are bringing us hopefully to a new level of transparency that we'll see in drug development moving forward. So when you get to the end, you'll know how you did. But even better than that, if you think about it before you start, when you get to the end, it'll look like the population you're trying to treat.
I love that. And for those who don't know, the behind the scenes role that Phyllis plays sometimes, she has been working with each one of our vaccine manufacturers, linking them with organizations like the National Association of Black Churches and the National Urban League and the National Medical Association, trying to help with enrollment. And just hats off, Hamilton, to you and your team for hitting 30.
Oh, Michelle, you hit mute somehow.
Oops, with Bravo for hitting 35% diverse populations with 29 of 30,000 patients enrolled. That's incredible. So there's a bunch of questions in the text box, so I'm going to try to hit some of them. First of all, hi Bob Cook-Deegan. I haven't seen you in a long time. Thanks for the question. This one is actually to me. It says, as CEO of Bio, do you think the changes in sharing information early, making protocols public, and other acceleration of science will persist and spill over to other areas of biomedical innovation even after we survive COVID-19? And the question is, we will not sleep until it does, because it's incredibly important. And I think you could tell from Phyllis's answer that we're seeing some unprecedented changes, both on the industry side and also from regulators and from others involved in the space. So we want to make sure that that speed and that transparency continues, and it's part of increasing the public's perception of our level of scientific integrity. Okay, so getting back to our panelists, so I believe it's incumbent on each of us to stand up for that integrity of science. So this is all looped together, and prevent it from being politicized or undermined. When world-class scientists, physicians, public servants are muzzled or worse, undermined for political convenience, and we as researchers, advocates, and executives must make our voice heard. And we've heard a little bit about this, of course, from Holden and what AAAS has been doing. Talk about how you and your organizations are thinking about these issues during this time of hyper-partisanship, and where we're seeing a disturbing amount of politics being injected into the scientific process. I'm going to put Phyllis on the hot seat first. Since you've been tracking this across the industry and both vaccines and therapeutics, I'd love to get your point of view on this.
So it's nice to be put on the spot by your boss. So I think actually that I'm very proud of the way industry has really tried to, in a bipartisan way, defend the science. And you saw this in several different ways. Certainly the work we've done at Bio. I think the pledge made by both large and small companies that they made publicly and then showed up, ads in the New York Times to really say, we are going to hold to the scientific integrity. We're going to, if we need to pause the trial because we see a side effect that we need to investigate, we will. You've seen that twice. If we need to slow down enrollment to get to the numbers, if we need to expand the number of people we're enrolling to get to the numbers, which is the Pfizer approach, they're going to do that. So I think we're seeing companies very clearly communicate, and from the top level, from the CEOs of those organizations on down, their commitment to holding to the gold standard of science and the gold standard of clinical investigator. I think that at Bio, we've tried to support the companies in this way by pushing for the EUA guidance. It was really important. We were already working on asking FDA for more clarity on how the EUA would apply to something as unique as a vaccine you're going to use in hundreds of millions of people. Most EUAs historically have been used for products that you're only going to use during a smallpox attack, right? So to actually want to apply the emergency use authorization, which is a very important regulatory tool of the agency, but it's not one you use all the time, and it's certainly not one that people talk about most of the time. So having that ability to have that engagement with the agency, not just sponsor to sponsor, but as industry to the agency, was pivotal. And I think being able to clearly support why it was so important to have the extra guidance on the emergency use authorization process and criteria, to have that ability to have that conversation about what was going to be necessary was a really important industry conversation, and I think actually exhibited how we can leverage science to make sure we're telling a good story to the American people on the vaccines when they come. And that, I think, is also true for the therapeutics in development as well, but even more so for the vaccines, where you're going to give them to healthy people in hundreds of millions of dose scale.
Wonderful. Anyone else want to weigh in on that one?
Well, I'd like to take a crack at it as well. And I want to appreciate the tone that you're trying to set. And I hear you in terms of the bipartisan activities and so forth. I chair the Alliance for Health Policy, the leading bipartisan health policy organization in the country, trying to reach bipartisan solutions for healthcare. But let us also make no mistake about this. The politicization that we have seen through the attacks on Tony Fauci, the attacks on the FDA, the attacks on the CDC, those things kill people. Let's be really clear. When people do not trust the basic fundamental scientific integrity of the United States health apparatus, people will not follow their guidance and they die. They don't wear masks when they should. They don't social distance when they should. This is hard fights. And so I am overwhelmed by Holden Thorpe and his colleagues. I saw a question where someone asked, is that important? Are they just talking to themselves? They're talking to this country, and they're saying to people, you must have confidence. When Bill Foege, the co-chair of the National Academy of Medicine report that I mentioned earlier, when Bill Foege has to write that painful letter to the director of the CDC, telling him, you had better stand up and hold the line on scientific integrity. He is saying it because if you don't, people will die. And so I think it is extraordinarily important that we don't get caught up in niceties and politenesses when people's lives are at stake. I will say to you that we, the community that I represent, and I'm privileged to be involved with in terms of the African-American community at this point in my career, is I will tell you that they are following very carefully the EUA. And when Peter Marks stood up as strongly as he did and said, we will not approve an EUA without 2 months of follow-up observation after a trial, that started to give back confidence. And lastly, I will say, I was extremely proud of your industry when all of those CEOs made it clear at a pivotal moment that said, look, we understand, clearly they knew the American people did not trust what was happening. And they said, we will behave in a responsible way even before we send something to the FDA. That was all those things build. My point to you is this. This is not a casual conversation trying to regain trust. It is not a theoretical political conversation. This is about life and death. And people of conscience in this industry cannot sit on their hands when they know that the weaponization of these political postures result in premature death and unnecessary misery and suffering. You have an obligation to be definitive and clear.
Thank you. Holden, you were touched upon in that comment, so could you jump in as well? Was science just talking to itself? Were the other scientific journals just preaching to the choir? Why is it important for scientists to make a stand?
Well, first of all, thank you, Reed. It's an honor to lead science and to speak for science when I have the opportunity and to support the great work that you and so many others are doing. Well, I have to say that, you know, I didn't become the editor of science in order to be the Maureen Dowd of science or whatever it is that I am. In March, when we dropped the first editorial, was right after Trump sent a tweet that's very famous now about how the flu was just as dangerous as COVID, and you've all memorized that tweet, I'm sure. It's despicable and horrible. And that's really what put us over the edge. So I think that when we started, for sure, just as Reed said, I felt it was a matter of life and death, and somebody had to start saying something. But over time, the other part that has been raised, which I don't trivialize at all, is that we are speaking for a lot of people who can't speak out because they work in the federal government, or they work at a university that has very conservative trustees, or you know, they have any number of conflicts. And fortunately for me, I work for Sudip Parikh, who's a scientist and the board of the AAAS. So what I do is really not all that courageous, because I'm not putting my job on the line in the way that a lot of other people who, for example, are in the NIH and staying in their jobs so that they can be there to help us. Those folks are people of enormous courage. And me and Eric Rubin and Richard Horton and Magdalena Skipper, we're all, you know, we're all speaking to our own readers. And, you know, certainly not all of them agree with what we're doing, but a lot of them do. And a lot of them write to thank us for speaking for them when they can't. And, you know, as Reed just said, this situation doesn't have a comparable example in my lifetime where, so, you know, saying we're going to do this when Donald Trump is the president, but we'll also do it when someone else is the president. This is one of a kind, I hope, event. And, you know, we'll go back to holding politicians accountable the way that Don Kennedy did and all my predecessors. And, you know, hopefully we won't have an issue like this where science is sitting in the middle of the whole story all the time. I'd love to write about astronomy and cancer immunotherapy and quantum computing. Yeah.
So there's a question here that's quite pointed, but I think it's really important to address head on because it has a lot to do, I think, with this question of trust. It says, are the behaviors of the pharmaceutical companies really responsible research, or rather protecting bottom lines and preventing lawsuits in the future? Should we really be trusting the goodwill of pharmaceutical companies to act responsibly? And I just want to address this questioner just head on for a moment. So I am a physician and a scientist, the daughter of two public health leaders, a former AAAS fellow. I spent close to 20 years in the federal government at FDA on Capitol Hill. And I've also worked within the pharmaceutical industry at Johnson & Johnson. And I will say it is a privilege to lead the 1,000 life science companies that I lead within bio. And it's because they are so committed to improving human health. They are intelligent, they are driven, they could be in any number of fields, but all of them have a personal commitment to human health. Do sometimes unforeseen events happen? Yes, that is for certain. But people do not go into scientific careers in the pharmaceutical industry to harm patients. They go in often because they have a personal or family experience with illness, and they want to spend their brain power and their life energy on trying to improve human health. So what you saw when you saw our 9 leading vaccine manufacturers stand up and say, you know, we want a strong FDA. We want to make it clear that we are going to be transparent with our results, and we are committed to making sure that the public understands our process, is the commitment that I have seen every day of the last 25 years, getting to work with manufacturers on both sides of this issue. So, you know, it's so frustrating to me. And we've had this conversation around the COSEP table as well. The skepticism of the private sector being completely unnecessary to the human health enterprise. If you think about it, 95% of the drugs that we have sitting on our shelves are coming from companies. They're not coming from academic labs. They're not coming from federal labs. When the federal government wanted to have Operation Warp Speed, it didn't pour the investment into federal labs or academic labs. It partnered with industry and still did not fully cover the costs. Industry has a very unique set of skills to be able to take the great scientific breakthroughs that happen at the academic bench and turn them into really pragmatic solutions that patients and doctors can actually use. And many of those are small companies like Moderna. We have been tracking absolutely every COVID drug development program since the beginning of the outbreak, over 740 programs, and 70% of those development programs are by small companies, small biotech companies that are risking their entire existence and the jobs of everyone that works for them on trying to do the right thing to help end this pandemic. So I invite everyone who shares that skepticism about the role of industry in human health to really look under the hood, to look carefully at not just when untoward things happen that can't be predicted, but the huge health gains that we have today because industries and companies have really dedicated themselves to human health. So sorry, I was on my soapbox there a little bit.
Awesome.
But Hamilton, I'm not sure if you want to weigh in on this as well.
Thank you, Michelle. And I really appreciate the role that bio has played in this. And certainly for those of us that are at smaller companies, we did stand up because we felt an obligation to respond. We knew that our technology could help. And many of us that are scientists are here, certainly in the vaccine space, because we value human life and we know that with good science, you can protect that.
Thank you, Hamilton. Anyone else like to weigh in or have any closing comments? Because we're getting into the last moments and I know
Actually,
there's still a lot to cover.
Yeah, you have about, I think we're going to 3:30. So I think you have a little time.
Excellent, excellent. All right, so let's go back to Robert. Robert, tell us a little bit about the concerns you're hearing from the diabetic community, and are they different concerns from different pockets of the communities?
Yes, well, you know, there is a lot of fear. The conversation we were just having about misinformation, I think plays out in the real world in so many ways. I continue to see patients and, you know, I've had a number of them ask me, you know, do you think it's safe? When they come in with the vaccine, should I take it? Am I really at high risk? Should I really be wearing a mask? And, you know, in some degree, it's stunning at this point of, you know, many months into the COVID pandemic that those questions are, you know, still surfacing. So there really is a need to use a megaphone and blast our voices out. And I applaud everyone on the panel that's been doing that. We reach out to the over 100 million people with diabetes and prediabetes to set the record straight, to use science to drive people's behavior. And I think that's more important now than it's ever been.
Michelle, one thing I would also just as a companion to that very important point, we have been able to organize together the 4 historically Black medical schools: Howard, Morehouse, Meharry, and Charles Drew University of Medicine, the National Medical Association, the W. Montague Cobb Institute, which is a think tank component of the NMA, the National Black Nurses Association, the National Urban League. And we put all of that firepower together and just conducted a town hall that was nationwide, supported in part by one of your member companies. It's called Making It Plain. And if you would like to, I would urge people to go to a website called blackdoctor.org. That's one word, blackdoctor.org. And you can replay the 2.5-hour show. We featured Gary Gibbons from NHLBI. Very important because most Black folk in the community have no idea that African Americans are prominently in positions of authority and power. We used Frida Lewis Hall, former chief medical officer of Pfizer. Amazing that people did not know that she exists as a leader. And we also had Peter Marks. Peter Marks is an extraordinarily useful, articulate, legitimate voice filled with integrity, who does not shy away from doing these kinds of events. And so we put all of this firepower together to answer those questions that we're facing in our community. I will tell you, it is still hard work, and we have lots more that we will have to do. We're gonna have to keep at it and keep at it and keep at it. But at least we have some examples now. We were able to reach 140,000 people just this weekend with that one show. 140,000 people were able to participate in that event. So we know there is a market for information. We know there is a desire and a hunger for trustworthy information coming from physicians and scientists of and from the Black community. We just have to keep at that and support it with people of goodwill from outside of the Black community. And I think people, Michelle, like you, who is from the Black community, but I mean people from Bio, and also people from the federal government are all going to be needed in a repetition. And lastly, Phyllis said something that I think is very, very important. And that is, even as we are focused so tenaciously on this historical moment, we've got to now be done with the past and build the bridge for the future. If we are still talking about Tuskegee 2 years from now, shame on everyone in bio, on everyone in healthcare delivery, on every African-American medical school president. We have got to do those things to get that stuff behind us. So we've got to look to the future, and everything we do now has got to not only be relevant for this historical moment, but it's got to build for the future.
That's an excellent point. Oh, was someone else going to jump in? Yeah, we had a question earlier. So this panel is really focused on vaccines and the confidence or lack thereof around them. But Phyllis, we had a question about COVID therapeutics. Could you give people just, your team tracks this out every day. Could you give people a little bird's eye view on what to expect there?
Absolutely. So there's over 300 therapeutics in development worldwide, and they fall into a couple of categories. You have those therapeutics that are in the antiviral category. They're meant to either clear the virus or in some way keep the virus from getting into the cells and causing illness. They could be used prophylactically, or they could also be used certainly in mild to moderate disease to help people clear the virus and get back to healthy, and hopefully keep from going on to the more severe illness that puts you on a ventilator, and causes the massive inflammation that affects so many other organ systems. In addition, there are companies working on very unique and important treatments for those various serious consequences. Companies working on anticoagulants. We heard about all the different issues with blood clots. People working on things that treat the the immunomodulators that treat that massive inflammation that happens, the cytokine storm. There's companies that are working on products that are meant to treat some of the heart issues that develop in particular. So there's a really fantastic set of both prophylactic/early treatment products, and then there's those later stage treatments for all the different sub-conditions. We're very excited to see, I think we will see hopefully in the next month and a half, hopefully very robust data on some of these monoclonal antibody approaches. And then right behind that, hopefully some new data on some of the more classic antiviral approaches that hopefully will bring the treatment of early stage disease out of the hospital into the doctor's office, and actually hopefully in the end into the pharmacy. So one of those things we're hoping is some of these technologies will bring products closer to the patient in ways that can really achieve access. As you think about, Xofluza for flu, right? If you feel you're a couple of days into your flu symptoms and you go get a script for that product, you can go to the pharmacy, get it, have a much lower case, be back to work quickly. The goal here is to get COVID to that point in terms of treatment where you can either get an antiviral or get a shot in the pharmacy even of a monoclonal antibody that helps you get to recovery quicker, or even vaccinate healthcare workers who've been exposed with that data. So this family of antivirals and monoclonal antibodies presents a great opportunity to treat COVID or even prevent COVID earlier in certain populations, either before a vaccine or if they've been exposed to COVID but haven't yet developed symptoms. It's an important set of products in the portfolio.
Yeah, and importantly, along those lines, I was on a panel with Janet Woodcock, formerly of FDA, now of Operation Warp Speed, yesterday for Milken, and she was sharing your confidence that we would very soon have perhaps sub-Q or IM intramuscular injections of some of the antibody-related therapies, and that is what's going to allow us to get to poor populations on a global scale.
Mm-hmm.
That, you know, when we have room temperature, one dose vaccines and, you know, easy to administer shot-based therapies will reach a much broader swath of people. Is that not?
And I think that actually goes with the overall way we do vaccine activities, particularly outside of the adolescent, the pediatric and adult populations. So you think about a product like the one I used to work on, like Gardasil, the HPV vaccine. The idea when you're trying to do healthcare in low resource settings is things like screen and treat, right? Very quickly using a relatively easy to use screening tool or diagnostic, and then you could indeed administer a shot of a monoclonal antibody even in some low resource settings in order to get people back to healthy in a setting where the hospital and the ventilator might not be an option. So I think the work being done on monoclonal antibodies and antivirals worldwide could actually help be that 1-2 punch between vaccine and easy to use treatments and easy to use diagnostics that allow us to get the pandemic under control worldwide.
Phyllis, I'm glad you made that. And if I could, Michelle, with your permission, I'm going to just sort of pivot on that a little bit, and let's remind ourselves of the other issue on this vaccine challenge now, and that is getting the vaccine into the community. We've talked about getting it into somebody's arm, but now we've got to get into the community. Let us make no mistake about how challenging that is going to be. The dissemination systems here will be a major logistical either nightmare, headache, or will be an innovation that will wow us all. I'm hoping for the wowing us all. I was the Commissioner of Public Health in the District of Columbia for a number of years, and I've had a chance to sort of see what it is like trying to make these things work. We're going to have challenges, of course, with storage of the vaccine. Who is the central dissemination point? If these are going to require refrigeration, will that be in a doctor's office or not? Will be major health clinics? Will this be done by the public health authorities at the local level or at the state level? How will those triage decisions work? My point ultimately is coming back to the beginning of this conversation, is we could, at the National Academy of Medicine, can make wonderful allocation decisions. What happens at the local level and the politics there are going to be huge. And so I think we're going to have to, and then we're going to have to be concerned with whether or not we have the economics of getting the vaccine into a person. Is this going to be covered by insurance? Not all insurance, as complicated as our multi-phase puzzle is for insurance, not all insurance products are going to cause this to be covered in terms of the copay or out of pockets to the individual. And then there's the reimbursement to the provider community. And they are going to be expecting their cut at being able to do this. So there are multiple steps. And I just keep coming back to that. I'm really fascinated by Hamilton's original slide. I've served for many years, Hamilton, as on the advisory committee to Francis Collins at NIH. I love the basic science, but I'm also very much a practical person that has to work on the other end of the telescope. And I would say, as exciting as that opening slide, it is equally complex on the other end, not only on the communication side, but the administration side. And this is where, again, it's going to take a level of intelligence and thoughtfulness that is, again, as equally innovative as almost as what the brilliance of the scientists on your end.
I love it. So Bob Cook-Deegan has another brilliant question for us that helps us pivot to that complexity downstream as well as to the future. So he writes, the COVID crisis has activated the biomedical innovation system in a way I have not seen in my lifetime, even for cancer or Alzheimer's. Your defense of the industry echoes from the efforts to develop penicillin during World War II, which I think is the closest historical parallel I can think of to the vaccine and the treatment challenge, even more so than for HIV, SARS, or Ebola. The key factor seems to be alignment between company interest and health outcomes. Misalignment of profitability and health outcomes or access seems deep problems in most of healthcare. Does the panel have ideas for taking the energy of COVID and trying to more generally realign profitability and population health?
Ooh.
Leave it to Bob
Yeah, wow.
to stop us. And with that, Bob Cook-Deacon drops the mic.
That's a great question. One of the observations I would say, and we've heard some examples of this, is that COVID, and while exposing so many of the inequities within our healthcare delivery system and the inadequacies of our public health system, it also has fueled innovation in so many different ways. And whether that's in what we've been talking about, the rapid response of vaccine development, or the points that were beautifully made about how we need to get from that vaccine to people and get it in their arms, I think there's been a whole other host of ways to reach out to people that are living with multiple diseases like diabetes through telemedicine, data sharing, uploading of information, access to digital health solutions. I think that's going to be the piece that is also going to be magnified through all of this. It already has, and I think that's going to be part of the solution that will be long-standing, that will outlive, hopefully, this pandemic that we're in the midst of.
Michelle, I'm facing the essence of this question on a daily basis in the work that I'm trying to do. Let me make no mistake, I am a very private sector oriented person. I spent 14 years of my career as an executive vice president, chief of medical affairs for a Fortune 20 health company. So I understand the private sector and I understand these issues very well. I think the challenge that bio does have, though, and make no mistake about it, is the distrust of this profit motive inside of communities that are fundamentally distrustful makes this work hard. And how we are able to either just get past it or to be able to find ways of being transparent and just face it head on, these are the challenges of the moment. And they're not easy challenges. And we should not make any mistake about that we have to confront it honestly with communities all across this country, because there is a sense that this profit motive is somehow pushing companies to move faster than they should, and that they will be playing loose and fast with the rules. As unfair as it is just a reality that has to be confronted. And all of our transparent efforts to try to engage the full, and this is not just the African American community or the Latino community or the Native American, it's all of America. There are pockets that have these kinds of distrust. So we're going to just have to face up to that and realize that the essence of that question is challenging and difficult, but we cannot be deterred, but we have to be transparent and be able to find ways to tell the truth that reflect the fundamental ethics and integrity that the businesses are being run with.
Yeah, and we have to walk the walk. You know, there was a question following up from Holden about, you know, what was the question that was referenced with Han? And, you know, we at BIO sent a letter to Secretary Alex Azar asking him to release the emergency use authorization guidance around COVID vaccines that was being kept back. It had been written by FDA, but not released by the administration. We sent a letter calling for its release and throwing down the gauntlet and saying it's very important for us to have clarity around this process and for the science to be uncontrovertible. And then following that, FDA was emboldened to release quite a bit of the text in a public docket posting. And then the White House released the guidance. So it's really important for us to be seen, and this is not a partisan issue. We would be taking the same stance no matter who was sitting in the White House if they're standing in the way of the integrity of the scientific process, because that is the only way we can work to rebuild trust with vulnerable communities, which is so important to do. So we have just 4 minutes remaining. I'd love to do the poll questions one last time.
Would you? Okay.
Yeah, I would.
Would you?
Let's see a before and after. I doubt we've moved people's minds too much, but at least we've had a vigorous conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So please, please vote. Would you participate in a COVID-19 clinical trial? And if the vaccine were available today, would you and your family take it? And there was a follow-up clarification asked. Do you mean an FDA approved and transparent vaccine? And yes, we mean an FDA approved and transparent vaccine. And if it helps anyone think, it's not looking likely that any of those will come before November 3rd. So this is something that's happening post-election. If that helps you
Post-election, that's right.
in your deliberations. So with that, can we have people vote a second time?
See how we do.
Let's see.
We moved
Are
the
you guys
needle a little.
are you guys seeing results? Mine is just kind of.
No, not yet, but it's probably being calculated.
Takes a moment. So while we're waiting for that, does anyone have any closing comments or thoughts?
I think, Michelle, that I want to just call out one other thing that I hope endures from this. Oh, there's the results. Hey, we moved the needle.
Excellent. Now we just have to have this dialogue at a national level.
With 350 million other people.
With 350 million other people. That's right.
I think the other thing I hope endures that we saw on the private and public side, but on the private side in particular, the amount of collaboration, I think is we're using this word unprecedented, is really remarkable, and I think actually is extraordinarily important to moving products. And I think that also reflects some of that commitment to the science and commitment to response. So I feel like this is the thing I say very often when I'm presenting. Remember, we're in a pandemic, and every industry actually rose to the occasion during this pandemic. Every private sector industry. Haynes made masks. GM made ventilators. This is our job as an industry. We make drugs and vaccines. And so we are doing our job just the way GM did their job, just the way, I mean, so I think it's important to look at this through that lens, which I guess I spend a lot of my time there because biodefense is in my remit at Bio, but that lens of the private sector responding to the unusual situation of a global pandemic and bringing all of its everything to bear, whatever it has to offer. So if you don't do something that relates to the pandemic directly, many industries decided to do something that related to the pandemic tangentially, but it was all helpful. And those products were shorter production time. We happen to have the thing that takes a long time to make and a lot of research to do it, but it's the same level of commitment from the private sector industry to resolving the global pandemic as you saw from other industries who went above and beyond to do the same thing. So I hope that people can think of our industry that way in this pandemic setting.
And it hasn't just been industry. There's been, a lot
Absolutely.
of collaborations and input from academia, from federal labs, from
Absolutely.
international groups. So that will have to be, unfortunately, our last word because we are out of time. Now I feel like we could sit and talk for the next 5 hours. I wish I could invite you all to virtual drinks. But thank you so much for coming and participating in the panel.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.